Western New York, including invasive species. So in order to combine our two projects, what we did was a really big portion with invasive species within areas that we were looking at biodiversity. So the biggest things that we are looking at is biodiversity, and what we were thinking was that, sorry, I lost my slide. Okay, the biggest point is, what is biodiversity? I know that I work in an area that there is, it's very urban. It's a lot of city students that have never really gotten out and about, and biodiversity tends to be something that they don't really understand. So overall, what is biodiversity? It's biotic organisms that reside in a certain area to make up an ecosystem. The big portion, just like other people have talked about as well, is we're looking at interrelationships, food webs, invasive species, connections between organisms, and how the number of these organisms are going to be influenced based on what's around them that can be supported in an environment. So the purpose of our study is for students to become aware of living things in their surrounding ecosystem. And not only that, we want them to understand that there's an importance of the ecosystem around them and the role that they play within it. We wanted to make sure that engaging students in this outward bound experience was going to be them really understanding their part in it and how their area also can affect other areas around them. So that's our big thing.
I think it's this one. Let me see if I can get this. Can you guys hear me? Okay, my study was more of a hands-on, more of a micro study of under Sarah's biodiversity, and I'm actually have a small pond and I'm fighting some invasive species. So my study is going to be checking on basically a study of watershed area. It's a small pond. What I started out doing is, after reading Sarah's presentation, she really lays out a really nice style of instructions and how to things. So my goal was to actually see on taking her information and actually putting it to an actual field test. So what I wanted to do is find the cause of the aquatic overgrowth, which means because the water area is full of an invasive species. What I wanted to also do is identify invasive species that are prevalent in New York State. Then once I identify them, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to remove it? Are we going to live with it? So that's where we got to determine there's some different actions we can take. Also in the study, I've chosen, or I've decided to choose a correction method. And then also with our project, we want to be able to, this will be a long-term deal. I also want to be able to monitor and record the corrective actions that would be best that we can add to our website. So go ahead, Sarah, I'll move it for you. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Some of the study actions, where am I at? Let's see. Some of the study actions of our website were, we actually created what they call a quadrat. A quadrat is just basically what you see up in the upper right-hand corner is some PVC tube, but it delineates an area that I wanted to decide how much of the invasive species. Also from Sarah's awesome project, she turned me on to a thing called the Simpson's Biodiversity Index. I employed that. Also from the quadrat, I identified the invasive species that's in the pond. If you look at the lower left side, it's pretty much a 0.35 acre pond that's behind my house. And that's an aerial view from Google Earth. Let me try the next slide here. Okay, Sarah, go ahead and if you want to explain how we went from here.
All right, so a big part that we had on our website was that we really wanted teachers to understand how to build the quadrat and use the quadrat. So the picture on the right-hand side, I actually completed this with a class. So instead of building the quadrat out of PVC pipe in order to make it a little more time efficient, I actually went out and put sticks all down at 1 foot increments and then created squares for the students. They were their individual squares, and they went out and they looked at the biodiversity of different organisms they could find within the area. And they did this in multiple locations. So this is kind of the basis for our project. And on our website, we added this website as well that shows exactly how to build the quadrats. And then Steve actually went out and built his own in order to test it. So we really wanted to make sure that there was a lot of engagement going on and getting students out there, getting them utilizing these materials and going out and really exploring so that this data could come back and be combined. A big thing was going from what they find in the quadrat to how that can then be used with that Simpson's Biodiversity Index. So the Simpson's Biodiversity Index, as you can see on the slide, is an index that gauges the number of species present and the relative abundance of each species. So basically, this index is helping us decide what the biodiversity is in the area, because you can get as many species as you want, but without using this information and calculating it, you're not able to really see what the biodiversity is in an area. And I know a lot of times students are surprised that even in an area where they don't think it's very abundant with species, they tend to find a lot of plants, and therefore that changes it and creates this higher number for the biodiversity index. One thing that is important on our website is there was actually part of our database is the inclusion of this number. So we're trying to kind of combine math along with science and really get that going together. So we both feel it's important that you're combining and finding these cross-curricular connections. With that, we're also trying to include a lot about field guides. So one thing we really added on our website was making sure that people understood how to use field guides, that there were lessons in order to know where to get them, how to get students using them. I put up an example of a field guide to aquatic invasive species because we did have a very large portion of our project with invasive species to help people identify what they were finding. On our website, you were able to document them based on your location and kind of classify. And this way, students are documenting what's found in their quadrat and their location and putting it into that database so that everyone is really able to see what's going on and what's happening in that area.
Okay. Now here is the invasive species using the quadrat and the field guides. I've actually found that in my pond the major culprit is hydrilla, which is a type of plant. You can see it growing. This is a picture that I took probably early mid-May, and now it's completely covered. You can see the growth here, that it's extremely aggressive. There's some other conclusions that I'll fill in. Yeah, it was very surprising to me. I'll get to them in a minute. What I like to do is describe this basic invasive species, and that would pretty much be that hydrilla is a monocot. A monocot is a seed leaf that it only has one package of food on it. And if you see how the upper right picture there, you can see that it looks like a little acorn. That's what its major seedling is. Now, another important part of this, I discovered that it's a rooted submerged perennial plant. So you can eradicate it, and if there's any of these pods left, they'll grow back the next year. So it's an incredibly invasive species. Some basic information is the leaves are 5 to 15 millimeters long. The leaves arranged in pairs on rows. Now there's different types of hydrilla that you can actually think, and there's a native species that's very close to this, but luckily with the field guides, I actually made a nice, easy identification. Basically, hydrilla was introduced in 1955, just after World War II, when a lot of the soldiers were bringing back a lot of the Pacific species, and that's where they pretty much got fresh water. And the hydrilla really started out as an aquatic plant, and it grows really aggressive. It's real pretty in aquariums. But in the early 80s, New York State and the federal government described it as a noxious weed, so it's really extremely invasive. Now, the most important part of my study is I want to figure out how to eradicate. Oh, I missed it. I want to learn how to eradicate it, and there's some different methods. There's the herbicides. Some quick information: we put 70 to 110 metric million tons a year in the United States from herbicides. And that is just, in this day and age, ridiculous. Another way you can remove it is mechanically. You can either go in with basically a bunch of, it looks like a water crop remover. It's not the best description, but they basically go through, and you'll see them on some golf courses. They'll pretty much chew it up, and it's pretty easy to get rid of once you get a major control of it. The other one is the biological method, and that was the one that I chose. But it has issues also. What I basically decided to go with is the Asian grass carp. Now, what these are, they're an invasive species that are from some of the rivers in China, around Thailand. But New York State allows you to have them with a permit. And what they do, they call them diploid and triploid fish. Diploid fish are pretty much the invasive species people release, and they can reproduce. Where New York State will allow you to have triploid fish, where as the fish are fertilized, they do a hot water to cold water, and it releases a third genetic trait where the fish are normal, but they can't reproduce. So when you go through the process of New York State, you send some information about it, and what it is let me move on. Some of the biggest thing I wanted to show is the symbiotic interactions between our native species and our invasive species. Shara was a floating plant, that's a non-invasive species, and the hydrilla was a root plant. And those two, come to find out, work interactive very well to each other. They change the pH balance, the free oxygen, and they both thrive very well. And that's one of the things I'm trying to eradicate. And then going on to our website, Sarah, if you want to explain that for us.
Yeah, so just real quick in our last minute, our website, which you guys will be able to go and see, we have a database similar to the Google Forms where you can input organisms from different areas. And then our suggestion would be for teachers to really take a look at all of the information as part of your assessment. Do exactly what Steve has done, where you're looking at these different methods of eradication for these invasive species. You're really having the discussions with your students where you're informally assessing constantly for what is biodiversity, why is it important, and the use of the field guide and the teacher resources that are all found on our website as well. We really wanted to make sure this was a really engaging outward-bound experience where students, just like Steve did, can go out and really use what they're doing, use these quadrats and discover and really get hands-on with it.
Well, thank you very much. We're having a lot of different approaches here. I like how you have the classroom where the students are learning how to develop quantitative data when they look at a rich environment, and that's certainly going to help with a lot of field work. And you're seeing now, as more organizations are finding ways to get citizens to input data, this becomes more and more important. And then you've got Steve here with an actual situation in his home environment, so you're help doing some problem solving. So here's another great activity that can be shared. Are there any questions from the audience before Daniel goes up next with his biofuels? Questions from the audience?